5,329. Let that number sit for a moment. 5,329 Iranian Shahed 238 jet-powered kamikaze drones launched in a single coordinated wave from coastal batteries, fast attack vessels, ground mobile launchers, and modified cargo aircraft operating over the Gulf of Oman, all directed at one target, Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest drone swarm ever assembled in the history of aerial warfare. A number so large that the Patriot batteries defending the base, the Phalanx close-in weapon systems on the perimeter, the F-35 combat air patrol aloft at the time of the wave's detection, the carrier-based air defenses of 2 strike groups in the Arabian Sea providing outer layer intercept support, and every other element of the most sophisticated integrated air defense network the United States military operates, combined together, simultaneously, could not engage more than 14% of them before the first ones hit the runway. 9 minutes. That is the total time between the moment the leading edge of the 5,000 drone wave crossed the outer detection threshold of Al Udeid's radar network and the moment the base's runway system was declared permanently non-operational by the Air Force engineering team that assessed the damage in the 48 hours that followed. Not temporarily closed pending repairs, permanently non-operational, a runway system that had handled more than 300 combat sorties per day for the duration of this conflict, the runway system through which every American air mission in the Middle East had been either launched, recovered, or logistically supported, declared permanently non-operational. It will not be repaired at its current location. The engineering team's assessment said what engineering teams say when the damage exceeds the threshold of what repair can restore to specification. It cannot be brought back to operational standard. The location is the problem. The runway is gone, and the ground it rested on cannot be the ground a runway rests on again. The reason the ground cannot support a runway again is what makes this strike different from every previous operation in this series. It is not what the drones did to the runway surface. It is what 5,329 drones carrying a specific payload, not all of them explosive, not all of them kamikaze, some of them carrying something that nobody was talking about in the first 48 hours of coverage, did to the foundation of the runway system, to the drainage infrastructure beneath it, to the sub-base geological stability that a runway requires over the operational lifetime that the Air Force plans around. I will explain that payload in detail. But first, I need you to understand the scale of what 5,000 drones looks like in the air, because the number alone does not convey it. Stay with me for the next 22 minutes. The number is the headline. The engineering is the story. Before we talk about the 9 minutes and the runway assessment, I want to help you understand what 5,329 drones actually looks like in the air, because the number is abstract in a way that hides the physical reality of what the base's radar operators, the fighter pilots airborne at intercept, and the ground crews sheltering across the flight line saw when the wave arrived. 5,000 drones is not a large formation. It is a weather event. A single Shahed 238 has a wingspan of approximately 2.5 meters. 5,329 of them, flying in a formation dense enough to present a continuous radar return rather than individual contacts, occupies an airspace volume of approximately 140 kilometers in width and 60 kilometers in depth at the formation density Iran used, an airspace volume 140 kilometers wide. That is wider than the entire state of Qatar from its western border to its eastern coast. The wave was wider than the country it was flying over. Every radar system in Qatar, military, civilian, commercial aviation, was simultaneously looking at the leading edge of a drone formation that was wider than the country those radars were designed to protect. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems that ring Al Udeid's perimeter can engage contacts at a maximum rate of approximately 4,500 rounds per minute, with a practical burst duration of 2 to 3 seconds before the thermal management system requires a cooling interval. Against a drone formation at close range, a Phalanx in continuous engagement mode can destroy contacts at a rate of approximately 1 every 2 to 3 seconds at its peak effectiveness. Against 5,329 drones arriving over a 9-minute window, every Phalanx system on the base perimeter would need to have been firing continuously from the moment the first drone appeared on the horizon to have made a material difference to the number that reached the runway. There are 11 Phalanx systems at Al Udeid. 11 Phalanx systems firing continuously for 9 minutes against 5,000 drones is a ratio that the mathematics of air defense does not resolve in the defender's favor. The F-35 Combat Air Patrol, 4 aircraft airborne at the time of detection, began engaging outer perimeter contacts as soon as the wave was identified and classified. Each F-35 carries a combat load of AIM-120D AMRAAM missiles for this kind of engagement, with a magazine capacity of 4 to 8 rounds depending on loadout configuration. 4 aircraft, at maximum loadout, carry between 16 and 32 missiles. 16 to 32 missiles against 5,329 contacts. The F-35 pilots did not run out of targets. They ran out of missiles in the first 90 seconds and transitioned to gun strafing runs, which is the most effective close-range engagement mode against drone swarms and the one with the highest per-sortie attrition rate, and which still did not change what happened to the runway in the 9 minutes that followed. The pilots performed with extraordinary professionalism against a problem whose mathematics were not going to be solved by professionalism alone. The number that matters for understanding the runway outcome is not 5,329, it is 4,183. The number of drones that the Air Force engineering team estimated reached the runway system based on the impact pattern analysis conducted in the 48 hours after the wave. 4,583 drone impacts across a runway system comprising 3 runways, 12 taxiways, and the apron areas connecting them. That is what permanently non-operational looks like from the engineering team's perspective, not the impact craters in the asphalt. What those 4,583 drones were carrying and what that payload did to the ground beneath the asphalt is the story of the 9 minutes. Not all 5,329 drones were kamikaze weapons in the traditional sense, a drone carrying an explosive warhead that detonates on impact and creates a crater. If all of them had carried standard high explosive warheads, the runway would have been severely damaged and temporarily closed. High explosive craters in runway asphalt are repairable. The Air Force has runway repair teams trained and equipped to fill craters and restore a degraded runway to operational status within hours for a temporary repair and within days for a permanent one. High explosive craters are a known problem with a known solution. Iran did not send 5,000 drones to create a problem with a known solution. Of the 5,329 drones, approximately 3,800 were carrying a thermite-based incendiary payload, rather than a high explosive warhead. Thermite is a mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide that, when ignited, burns at approximately 2,500 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to melt through steel, hot enough to burn through asphalt, and hot enough to penetrate into the sub-base material beneath the asphalt and alter its physical properties in ways that are not repairable by conventional runway repair methods. A thermite payload does not crater a runway. It burns into it. It penetrates through the asphalt surface layer, through the aggregate base course beneath, and into the subgrade, the compacted soil and engineered fill material that provides the load-bearing foundation the runway rests on. At 2,500 degrees Celsius, the subgrade material in the specific area of the thermite burn is not just scorched. Its structural properties are permanently altered. The load-bearing capacity of the burned zone is reduced to a fraction of its original specification. A runway surface rebuilt over burned subgrade does not have the load-bearing capacity required for military aircraft operations. The F-35 weighs approximately 31,000 pounds empty. The B-2 weighs approximately 158,000 pounds empty. A runway whose subgrade has been thermite treated across a significant percentage of its area cannot safely bear those loads. 3,800 thermite drones impacting across 3 runways and 12 taxiways at Udeid, with impact patterns designed to achieve subgrade treatment across the maximum possible percentage of the runway system's area, produced a subgrade damage pattern that the engineering team's ground-penetrating radar survey characterized as affecting between 68 and 74% of the runway system's total load-bearing foundation area. 68 to 74% of the foundation permanently altered. A runway system operates safely when its foundation meets specification across its entire area, because the weakest zone of a runway is the zone that fails first under repeated aircraft loading. You cannot operate a runway at 68 to 74% foundation integrity. You cannot patch around it. The entire subbase would need to be excavated, removed, and replaced with new engineered fill material compacted to specification. That operation, at Al Udeid's scale, takes between 18 months and 3 years under ideal construction conditions. In Qatar's summer heat, with the supply chain constraints affecting the theater's logistics, the engineering team's assessment was on the longer end of that range. The remaining 1,529 drones carried standard high explosive warheads. Their targets were not the runway surface. They were the aircraft parking apron, the fuel farm, the maintenance hangars, the perimeter lighting system, the arresting gear installations, and the runway lighting and navigation aid infrastructure. The high explosive component of the strike destroyed the infrastructure that makes a runway operational rather than merely a paved surface. An intact runway without functioning fuel systems, arresting gear, lighting, and navigation aids is not an operational airfield. It is a very long parking lot. The thermite component ensured the runway surface itself could not be restored. The high explosive component ensured that even if the surface were somehow restored, the infrastructure that makes it useful would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Together, they produce permanent non-operational status in 9 minutes. Let me walk you through the 9 minutes in sequence, because the wave architecture Iran used was not simply a large number of drones launched in one direction. It was 4 distinct waves timed to defeat 4 specific defensive systems in a sequence that left each successive wave facing progressively degraded opposition. Wave 1 arrived at 6:14:22. 1,200 Shahed 238 drones on a primary approach axis from the northwest, flying at 400 meters altitude and 350 kilometers per hour. Their role was to trigger every air defense system Udeid operated: Patriot batteries, phalanx systems, rolling airframe missile launchers, the airborne F-35 CAP, into full engagement mode simultaneously, consuming interceptor magazines, overheating close-in weapon systems, and forcing the battle management picture maintained by the E-2D Hawkeye to allocate its tracking and guidance resources to the primary axis. 1,200 contacts on the primary axis is a number that fully saturates every engagement system the base operates and leaves nothing in reserve. The first wave was not designed to hit the runway. It was designed to empty the magazine. Wave 2 arrived at 6:16:08, 1 minute and 46 seconds after the first wave's leading edge crossed the detection threshold. 2,114 thermite payload drones on 3 simultaneous approach axes: northwest, southeast, and south, arriving as the Patriot batteries were completing engagement sequences against the first wave, and the phalanx systems were entering their thermal management cooling intervals. The combined intercept capacity of the base's defense architecture at this moment was a fraction of what it had been 90 seconds earlier. The phalanx guns were cycling. The Patriot batteries had expended the majority of their remaining interceptor inventory against the first wave's high-density contact environment. The rolling airframe missiles had been exhausted in the first wave entirely. 2,114 thermite drones on 3 approach axes against a defense that had just fought its peak engagement and was still processing the aftermath is not a balanced contest. It is arithmetic. Most of the thermite wave reached the runway. Wave 3 arrived at 6:19:44, 5 minutes and 22 seconds after the first wave. 1,486 thermite payload drones on 2 approach axes perpendicular to the second wave's axis, targeting the taxiway system and the apron areas that the second wave's runway-centered targeting had left partially covered. The base's air defense at this point was operating on whatever ammunition remained after 2-wave engagements, with phalanx systems that had been cycling between engagement and thermal management throughout the previous 5 minutes, and with the F-35 CAP having transitioned to gun strafing runs that had reduced their own fuel and ordnance to minimum combat margins. The third wave completed the thermite treatment of the taxiway and apron foundation areas that the second wave had not fully covered. By 6:21:30, 7 minutes and 8 seconds after the first contact, the thermite treatment of the runway system's subgrade was substantially complete. Wave 4 arrived at 6:22:47, 8 minutes and 25 seconds after the first wave. 529 high-explosive drones targeting the fuel farm, maintenance hangars, perimeter infrastructure, and runway lighting system. With the base's active defense architecture at minimum residual capacity, after 3 waves of continuous engagement, the 4th wave reached its targets with minimal interception. The fuel farm detonated at 6:23:04, a secondary explosion that the base's damage control teams would later assess as the single most destructive event of the 9-minute strike in terms of immediate structural damage to the base's operational infrastructure. At 6:23:22, 9 minutes after the first drone crossed the detection threshold, the last 4th wave impact completed. Udeid's runway system had received 4,583 thermite and high-explosive impacts. Its subgrade was permanently altered across 68 to 74% of its load-bearing area. Its fuel system was destroyed. Its maintenance infrastructure was burning. Its perimeter lighting and navigation aids were gone. The runways that had launched and recovered 300 combat sorties per day for 19 months of conflict would not launch or recover another aircraft, ever, at that location. Right here, I want to pause and hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, your country, your city. The series has built a community across the entire world, and I want to know who is in this conversation. And tell me this specifically. Did you know that thermite-based runway denial munitions existed as a military concept before this video? Did you know about the subgrade foundation vulnerability that makes thermite more effective against runways than high-explosive craters? Because I'm genuinely curious how much of the engineering in this strike was already familiar to people watching this channel. Tell me in the comments right now, and let us keep going, because what happened to American air power in this theater after the runway closed is the part of the story that matters most for where this conflict goes next. Permanently non-operational is a phrase that sounds final but requires unpacking, because what it means in practice for American air operations in the Middle East is something more complex and more operationally significant than simply no more flights from Udeid. Let me explain what permanently non-operational actually means for the air campaign, for the logistics network, for the command architecture, and for the timeline of this conflict. The immediate air power consequence is the loss of Al-Udeid's sortie generation capacity for the duration of the conflict and well beyond it. Al-Udeid was generating between 280 and 320 combat sorties per day at its peak operational tempo during this conflict. More daily sortie generation than any other single airfield in the theater, including the carrier flight decks combined. Those sorties do not disappear when the runway closes. They need somewhere else to go. The alternate airfields available to absorb Al-Udeid's sortie load are Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and the carrier decks in the Arabian Sea. Prince Sultan can absorb approximately 80 sorties per day of additional capacity beyond its current operational load before its support infrastructure reaches saturation. Al Dhafra can absorb approximately 60. The carrier decks can surge to a combined additional 120 sorties per day under maximum sustainable tempo. That is 260 sorties per day of absorptive capacity against 280 to 320 that need to be accommodated. The math produces a permanent reduction of between 15 and 20% in the theater's daily combat sortie generation. For a campaign that has already been operating at reduced capacity from the alternate CENTCOM headquarters, a further 15 to 20% reduction in sortie generation is not a minor efficiency loss. It is a material degradation in the ability to sustain the operations the campaign requires. The logistics consequence is larger than the sortie consequence. Al-Udeid was not just an airfield. It was the primary logistics hub for American military operations across the entire theater, the facility through which spare parts, medical supplies, ammunition, personnel rotations, and the hundreds of categories of material that sustain a military campaign flow to forward positions. Logistics aircraft that land at Al-Udeid with supplies for forward bases cannot land there anymore. They need alternate landing points, alternate distribution networks, alternate ground transportation routes from those alternate landing points to the positions that Al-Udeid was supplying directly. Building alternate logistics, routing from scratch, in a theater where the communications and command architecture is already degraded and the forward base infrastructure has been under sustained attack for 19 months, takes time. The supplies still move. They move more slowly through longer routes, with more handling and more risk of disruption at each additional handling point. Logistics degradation compounds operational degradation in ways that do not show up in sortie counts, but accumulate in the readiness rates of the equipment that the logistics chain is supposed to keep operational. The timeline consequence is the most strategically significant and the most difficult to reverse. The engineering team's assessment of the runway restoration timeline, 18 months to 3 years for full restoration, assuming ideal construction conditions and uninterrupted supply chain access, means that Al-Udeid is not a strategic asset that recovers on any timeline relevant to the current conflict. If this conflict reaches a negotiated resolution in the next 6 months, Al-Udeid's runway will still be non-operational at the time of the resolution. If the conflict continues for another 18 months, Al-Udeid's runway will still be non-operational at the end of it. The closure is not a temporary disruption that the conflict's outcome will resolve. It is a structural feature of the post-conflict environment in the Middle East, regardless of how the conflict ends. The most important American airfield in the region will be a construction site for between 18 months and 3 years starting from today. Every military and diplomatic decision made in that period will be made in a strategic environment where the United States does not have Al-Udeid as a functioning airfield. Let us talk about the economics of 5,329 drones, because the cost exchange ratio of this strike is the most extreme in the entire series, and it tells you something fundamental about why Iran chose this specific method at this specific moment. A Shahed 238 costs Iran between $75,000 and $120,000 to produce and deploy, depending on the payload variant. At the midpoint of that range, call it $97,500 per drone. 5,329 drones at $97,500 each represents a total offensive cost of approximately $519 million. That is the cost Iran paid to permanently close Al-Udeid's runway system, $519 million. The cost to the United States of the strike has 5 components. The first is the immediate defensive expenditure, interceptors, gun ammunition, missile system maintenance, and aircraft operations, costs across 9 minutes of maximum intensity air defense engagement, estimated at between $800 million and $1.2 billion based on the interceptor types and quantities expended. The second is the direct infrastructure loss, Al-Udeid's runway system, fuel farm, maintenance hangars, and perimeter infrastructure. The replacement cost of the physical infrastructure destroyed or requiring replacement is estimated at between $2.4 and $3.1 billion. The third is the operational cost of the reduced sortie generation over the restoration timeline, the cost of reduced campaign effectiveness, increased logistics routing, reduced readiness, and the operational friction of the 18-month to 3-year restoration period. This is the hardest component to quantify, but defense economists, estimating the operational cost of a comparable sortie generation reduction over an 18-month period, produce figures in the range of $4 to $7 billion in reduced campaign effectiveness. The fourth component is the restoration cost itself, the engineering, materials, and construction for the runway, subgrade replacement, and reconstruction, estimated at between $1.8 and $2.6 billion. The fifth is the strategic cost, the value of the deterrence, the alliance reassurance, the political signaling, and the operational flexibility that Al-Udeid's active status provided, which is not a figure that can be expressed in dollars, but which every government in the region is implicitly calculating in the diplomatic decisions they are making in the weeks following the strike. The four quantifiable components total between $9 and $13.9 billion, against an offensive cost of $519 million. The cost-exchange ratio is between 17 to 1 and 27 to 1 in Iran's favor. $17 to $27 of damage and cost imposed on the United States for every dollar Iran spent on the strike. This is not the most lethal strike in the series. It produced no American fatalities. It produced no structural collapse. It produced no communications blackout. What it produced was the most economically efficient, permanent denial of a major American military asset in the history of this conflict, at a cost ratio that makes every previous operation's economics look expensive by comparison. The 5,000-drone thermite strike on Al-Udeid's runways was not invented for this operation. It was built over 19 months of operations that each contributed one specific piece of the design. Understanding which previous operation contributed which piece of the Al-Udeid drone strike's architecture is understanding how a military campaign learns and applies its learning in progressively more sophisticated ways. The magazine depletion sequencing, the 4-wave architecture timed to defeat each defensive layer before the next wave arrived, was the direct application of the lesson from the first major drone wave we covered in this series' 12th video, when 500 drones at 2 carriers demonstrated the relationship between wave architecture and interceptor exhaustion. The specific timing intervals between waves at Al-Udeid, 1 minute 46 seconds between wave 1 and wave 2, long enough for the Patriot batteries to complete their first wave engagements and commit to engagement sequences that prevented immediate retargeting to the incoming second wave, were calibrated from the engagement timing data that Iran's post-operation analysis of the carrier drone engagement produced. The lesson from 500 drones was applied at a scale 19 times larger. The thermite payload itself was a development that the Al-Udeid runway engineering vulnerability pointed toward long before this strike. The runway vulnerability, the dependence of military runways on subgrade integrity that thermite can compromise in ways that high explosive cannot, is documented in open-source military engineering literature going back to the 1970s. What Iran's development program produced was a thermite payload small enough to be carried by a drone-class platform, reliable enough to function at the impact dynamics of a Shahed 238 striking at 350 kilometers per hour, and designed to penetrate through asphalt and aggregate base course before initiating, which requires a delayed ignition system that activates after the drone has punched through the surface layers rather than detonating on the asphalt itself. The development of a drone-deployable thermite penetrator that initiates at subbase depth is a specific engineering achievement that did not exist in the Iranian inventory at the beginning of this conflict. It was developed during it. The specific intelligence about Al-Udeid's runway construction specifications, the asphalt layer depth, the aggregate base course thickness, the subgrade material composition that informed the thermite penetrator's design came from the RQ-180 engineering documentation, recovered from the drone we covered in this series' 10th operation. The sensor bay documentation gave Iran the construction survey data for multiple American military airfields it had overflown. Al-Udeid was on the list. 19 operations, 19 months. The series has now documented the systematic permanent denial of 2 of the 3 most important American military assets in the Middle East: the CENTCOM forward headquarters at Al-Udeid, which will not be rebuilt at its original location, and now the Al-Udeid runway system, which will not be restored for between 18 months and 3 years. The third major asset, the carrier strike groups, have been rendered combat ineffective multiple times and are in various stages of repair and reconstitution. The American military is operating in the Middle East from a degraded, distributed, reduced capacity architecture that bears only a passing resemblance to the force structure it entered this conflict with 19 months ago. The economics of the runway strike, $119 million of offensive cost against $9 to $13.9 billion of damage, denial, and operational cost, produce a cost exchange ratio that makes the conflict economically unsustainable for the United States. At the current operational tempo, without producing a comparable rate of strategic progress toward whatever the American strategic objective in this conflict is. That objective, the precise formulation of what the United States is trying to achieve, and what it would accept as sufficient achievement, is something that has never been publicly articulated with the precision that would allow the cost rate to be assessed against a defined end state. The absence of that articulation is not an accident of communication. It is a reflection of the genuine difficulty of defining what success looks like in a conflict that has evolved across 19 months in ways that the original strategic framework did not anticipate. The ceasefire proposal has been on the Omani Channel's table since the first Udeid strike. It remains there. It now sits in a context that includes a permanently closed CENTCOM headquarters location, a permanently non-operational runway system at Udeid, 3 aircraft carriers in various stages of repair, 47 Americans killed at Naples, 3 pilots killed resuming carrier operations after a 6-day grounding, 61 Americans killed in the Naples strike, 73 killed in the 444 missile CENTCOM strike, 61 in the 333 missile strike, and the accumulated casualties of 19 months of conflict whose full count appears in the notifications delivered to families whose addresses the Department of Defense has on file. The proposal offers a path to stopping. The path requires accepting terms that 18 months ago would have been rejected immediately. The terms have not changed. The context has. And the context is everything. Nobody died in the Udeid drone strike. Nobody. 5,329 drones, 9 minutes, 4,583 impacts, permanent runway denial across the most important American airfield in the Middle East, and 0 American fatalities. The base's sheltering protocols, the hardened personnel facilities, and the 11 minutes of warning time between the first radar detection and the first impact allowed every person on the base to reach shelter before the drones arrived. Nobody died. That fact, that the most economically devastating single strike in this series killed no one, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about the nature of what this conflict has become. The early operations killed people and damaged equipment. The middle operations killed people and destroyed buildings. The later operations killed people and closed headquarters permanently. This one closed a runway permanently and killed nobody. Iran designed a strike whose objective was infrastructure denial rather than personnel elimination at an economic efficiency that makes every previous operation look expensive, using a payload innovation developed specifically from intelligence data collected in a previous operation. The evolution from killing people to denying infrastructure at minimum cost and maximum economic impact is the evolution of a campaign that has learned, over 19 months, that the most consequential damage is not necessarily the deadliest. The runway at Udeid will be a construction site for the next 18 months to 3 years. The aircraft that used to launch from it are launching from elsewhere, more slowly, with more friction, at reduced tempo. The conflict continues. The mission does not stop. It continues from the alternate locations, at the reduced sortie rate, through the longer logistics routes, with the degraded command architecture on the terms that 19 months of systematic assumption retirement have imposed. Share this video if it has given you a framework for understanding how those terms were imposed, one operation at a time, across 19 months. Share it with someone who is following this conflict and needs the complete picture. Hit share right now and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me whether you think the thermite drone swarm, no fatalities, maximum infrastructure denial, minimum cost, represents the most sophisticated operation in this series, or whether one of the earlier ones earns that title. Tell me what the 20th operation looks like. Tell me whether the ceasefire proposal gets accepted before or after that 20th operation happens. This community has been thinking seriously about this conflict for 19 videos, and I want your read on where the 19th leaves things. Leave it in the comments. Stay with this story.